The real rate of return in the gold standard, part of our lecture series on inflation. In this video, we'll talk about how to think about inflation when considering investment and retirement situations, why inflation was not a problem in the United States until around 1933, and why the opposite of inflation might be a bigger problem to our economy than a high level of inflation. So, first of all, I want to talk about something called the real rate of return. Now, if you remember from previous lectures, we talked about the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP, in that nominal GDP included the price level, but real GDP did not. And we have the same thing whenever we're talking about returns on investment. So you may hear about an investment that earns a 5% return. And your first question should be whether that 5% return is a nominal rate of return or if it's a real rate of return, because a nominal rate of return would not take into account inflation. So, for example, if you are considering whether to invest in a company that promises a 5% rate of return, if it's a nominal rate of return, you're actually only making about 3% on your money, which is still pretty good. But if it's a real rate of return, then you're making 5% on your money. And so you can see that's a very different thing. All savings accounts and certificates of deposit and safe investments like that earn a very low rate of interest in our country currently. They didn't always, but they do currently. And so if you can find a savings account that pays 1% interest, that's actually a really good deal in terms of savings account these days. But even if it pays a 1% rate of interest, that savings account, the money in that savings account is going to lose value over time because that 1% is a nominal rate of return. It's not a real rate of return. Because the inflation rate is around 2%, the real rate of return is around negative 1%. I showed this graph previously. This again is the graph on a log scale, which means the numbers get much higher as you go up in the y-axis. And what we see, even in the log scale, is that inflation was pretty stable up until 1934 or so, and then it started increasing rapidly. And we have a quote here from Herbert Hoover, who until recently was thought of as one of the worst presidents of all time. And a quote from Herbert Hoover says, "We have gold because we cannot trust governments." And so the reason why we have this stable level of prices back to 1774, back to before the Declaration of Independence, is due to something called the gold standard. Now, the gold standard is actually kind of easy to define. What the gold standard was that the price of gold was fixed in United States dollars. In fact, $20.67 would buy an ounce of gold throughout the whole period of time that the gold standard was in effect, which is roughly from 1835 to 1934. The U.S. Treasury and then the Federal Reserve afterwards had to maintain enough gold on hand so that anyone who wanted to change dollars into gold could do that. And so this made sure that the U.S. currency had two advantages. The first is price stability, and the second is government non-interference. Price stability was remarkable under the gold standard. The price of a good in 1800 was the same as a price of a good in 1900. Now, there were ups and downs in the meantime due to the Civil War and other reasons, but for the most part, prices were stable, and this allowed businesses and investors to plan and also made distant trade much easier. So even if it took months for goods to get from another country to the U.S., because the money was on a gold standard, it became much easier to trade over long distances and over long periods of time. The second advantage was government non-interference. Because the price of gold is fixed, the money supply is not controlled by the U.S. government. Instead, the money supply depends on these outside factors, such as the amount of gold mined, how they find new sources of gold, or whether they find new sources of gold, the technology used in mining, and how much gold is used for non-monetary usage. In other words, in jewelry or in high-tech devices or something like that. So that all sounds great, right? Price stability is a great thing to have, and the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is the agency in charge of how the money supply works in the US, is actually tasked with maintaining stable prices among its other responsibilities. So we could get rid of the U.S. Federal Reserve and all of the people that work there, and there are thousands of people who work in the Federal Reserve. And we could instead just pin the price of U.S. dollars to gold the same way we did back during that time of the gold standard. But it would not work today. And it wouldn't work today for two main reasons. The first one is that the role of the government has changed, and also due to deflation. So in the 20th century, the role that government played in people's lives changed. It started with 1933 when the Great Depression occurred, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt started the New Deal, which was a series of programs that created the start of the social safety net that we have today. Many of the things we think that the government does, such as Social Security, such as ensuring bank deposits, such as school lunches for children of low economic status, all of these things came out of the New Deal and the expanded size of the federal budget. In addition, new voters were added to the electorate. In 1919, women were allowed to vote, and in 1965, after the Voting Rights Act, African Americans were finally given the right to vote that they should have been given in the amendments to the Constitution passed after the U.S. Civil War in 1865. But these two things, the changing role of government and the new parts of the electorate, means that the government nowadays has a much larger role in cushioning the impact of adverse economic circumstances than it used to. We all know that the COVID stimulus checks that appeared in mid 2020, this kind of stimulus, this kind of distribution would not have happened prior to 1933. And it's these 20th century changes that make the gold standard not feasible. And the other reason is that if we had total price stability, it would mean that inflation must be countered by deflation. And deflation would be much more damaging to the economy than inflation. Deflation would just mean the overall level of prices would drop. And in general, creditors would win, and in general, debtors would lose. So in other words, it would become much more difficult for you to pay off your student loans, for people to pay off their mortgages. And when it becomes more difficult for people to do that, they tend to default on that debt. They tend to not pay it, and the bank does not recover any money from them. And if that happens, if people default on their debt, and enough people default on that debt, that could cause banks and other companies to go out of business, and that leads to a large financial situation, which I think would happen with a long period of deflation. We have had two smaller periods of deflation recently, briefly during the Great Recession in 2008, and also during the first 3 months of the pandemic, but these were quickly reversed. Deflation would also result in very little private investment because it would be, if you held on to your money, it would become more valuable over time. So investments are less attractive because if deflation is at 5% and your investment return is 3%, you're actually going to lose 2% on your money as opposed to just holding on to it. And the price rigidities we talked about in a previous lecture about inflation all still apply to deflation, and the fact that some prices would adjust more slowly than others would again hurt consumers and the public. This is an example of deflation that happened from 1880 to about 1910. And what you see is in the first part of this graph, this is a price index of wholesale prices. In the first part of this graph, that's the Civil War, that big spike there, the big spike of inflation. But because the US is on the gold standard, it must have countered that initial inflation with a period of deflation. And that's the big trough that you see starting in 1877 and continuing again until 1910, where investment had shrunk and prices were going down, and a lot of the working class and the middle class were badly affected by this economic slowdown that lasted about 35 years. And so that's not really feasible. Something like that is not really feasible in today's economic world. So what we talked about in this lecture, we talked that it was important to differentiate between the real and nominal rates of return. How the gold standard ensured relatively reasonable prices, relatively stable prices for the period of time before 1934, but that deflation, if it occurred, would be much worse for our economy than inflation if it was steady throughout several quarters. Thank you.